Book 12. Priam had no idea that his son had been changed to a bird, and was still alive, so he went into mourning. Aeschylus's name was inscribed on a tomb where Hector offered his funeral gifts, to no good purpose, along with his brothers. Only Paris was missing, the prince who later involved his country in war, long years of war, along with Helen, his stolen bride. A Confederate fleet of 1,000 ships from the whole of Greece was formed to pursue them, and vengeance would not have been long delayed if stormy winds hadn't barred the seas and frustratingly stranded the vessels at Aulis, famous for fish, in the Bay of Boeotia. Here the host of the Greeks had prepared to offer the customary sacrifices to Jove. The fires on an ancient altar had duly been lit, and the glowing coals were awaiting a victim, when all of a sudden the people noticed a blue-green serpent spiraling up a plane tree close to the sacred precinct. Right at the top of the tree was a nest which contained 8 fledglings. These were seized in the serpent's fangs and greedily gulped down, before it devoured the mother bird as she fluttered around the chicks she was losing. The crowd was dumbfounded, but Calchas the prophet unfolded his vision. "Rejoice, you Greeks! We surely will triumph. Troy must fall, but our toil shall be long. These 9 dead birds presage 9 years of war." The snake, still coiled in the tree's green branches, turned into stone in the form of a serpentine sculpture. The storm continued to rage on the sea in the straits of Euboea. The fleet couldn't sail to war. There were some who believed that Neptune was sparing Troy because he had built the walls of the city. But not so Calchas the prophet, who knew full well and loudly proclaimed that the wrath of a virgin goddess must be appeased by a virgin's blood. When a father's love for his daughter had yielded to kingly thought for the public good, and Iphigenia, surrounded by weeping attendants, was standing in front of the altar to offer her innocent blood, the goddess was moved to pity and shrouded the scene in a blanket of mist. As the business proceeded, amidst the confusion of ritual and voices uplifted in prayer, the story goes that she substituted a hind for the maiden. And so Diana was soothed as required by a victim's death, and along with the wrath of the goddess, the wrath of the sea subsided. The Greeks in their 1,000 ships set sail with a following wind, and after all they had suffered arrived on the Trojan beaches. Picture a space at the heart of the world, between the earth, the sea, and the sky, on the frontiers of all 3 parts of the universe. Here there are eyes for whatever goes on, no matter how distant, and here there are ears whose hollows no voice can fail to penetrate. This is the kingdom of Rumour, who chose to live on a mountain, with numberless entrances into her house and 1,000 additional holes, though none of her thresholds are barred with a gate or a door. Open by night and by day, constructed entirely of sounding brass, the whole place hums and echoes, repeating whatever it hears. Not one of the rooms is silent or quiet, but none is disturbed by shouting. The noise is merely a murmuring babble, like the waves of the sea which you hear from afar, or the last faint rumble of thunder, when storm-black clouds have clashed in the sky. The hall is filled by a crowd which is constantly coming and going, a flimsy throng of 1,000 rumors, true and fictitious, wandering far and wide in a turbulent tangle of language. They chatter in empty ears or pass on stories to others. The fiction grows and detail is added by each new teller. This is the haunt of credulity, irresponsible error, groundless joy, unreasoning panic, impulsive sedition, and whispering gossip. Rumour herself spies every occurrence, on earth, at sea, in the sky, and her scrutiny ranges the universe. Rumour had spread the report in Troy that a fleet was approaching from Greece with an army on board. So when the expected invaders arrived, the Trojans were watching the shore to prevent the landing. The first Greek destined to fall to the spear of the valiant Hector was Protesilaus. Battles were fought which cost the Danaans dear, and Hector's courage was known in the deaths he inflicted. Achaean might was also attested by Phrygian losses. By now the shores of Sigeum were red with blood. By now the Trojan offspring of Neptune, Cycnus, had taken 1,000 lives, while Achilles the Greek charged round in his chariot, laying whole ranks of his enemies low with his spear of ash from Mount Pelion. Searching the battle lines for either Cycnus or Hector, he lighted on Cycnus. His duel with Hector was not to take place for another 9 years. At once, with a shout to his white-maned horses, he steered his chariot straight at his foe, and cried, as he powerfully brandished his weapons, "Whoever you are, young man, you will have this consolation in death. You were slain by the mighty Achilles." He spoke, and followed his words with a cast of his mighty spear. The weapon was perfectly aimed, but the aim was perfectly useless. The point was blunted and merely succeeded in bruising its target's chest. "Son of Thetis," Cycnus replied, "yes, Rumour has told me all about you. Why be so surprised that I haven't been wounded?" Achilles was certainly looking surprised. "This helmet with chestnut, horsehair plumes, and the shield you can see on my left arm offer me no protection at all. I wear them purely for show, just as Mars the war god is dressed for show. You can take every piece of my armor away, but I'll leave without the slightest of scratches. I'm not the son of a Nereid. No, I'm the son of the god who is lord of the sea, and of Nereus and all the daughters of Nereus." So speaking, he flung his spear, but it only lodged in Achilles' shield, where it pierced the cover of bronze and the layers of oxhide, 9 of them, lying behind to be finally stopped by the 10th. It was shaken off by the hero, who hurled a second quivering weapon with all the strength of his arm, but his target remained unwounded and whole. A third attempt was no more successful. Though Cycnus presented his body unguarded, it bore not a scratch. Achilles exploded with rage, like a bull in an open arena, which savagely charges the scarlet cloak held up to provoke him, but finds he has dealt no wound, and his dangerous horns have been thwarted. He wondered whether the tip of his weapon had fallen off, but no, it was fixed to the shaft. Then he asked, "Has my arm gone feeble, and wasted all of its earlier strength on a single opponent? It must have been strong when I led the attack on Lyrnessus' walls, when I washed Aeacian city of Thebae and Tenedos island in blood, when the Mysian river Caicus was red with the slaughter of all its people, when Telephus twice was touched by my spear. Here also in Troy, when I look at the piles of corpses I've scattered along the shore, I can see that my hand has been strong and remains so." Such were his thoughts when, as though he mistrusted his former achievements, he flung his spear at a Lycian, Minoetes, advancing towards him, and pierced the warrior's corslet through to the breast it protected. As soon as his dying victim struck the ground with his head, Achilles extracted the spear, still warm from the wound, and he cried out, "This is the hand and this is the spear which have won me my victory. Now I shall use them on him, and I pray for a victory as certain." So speaking, he aimed at Cycnus again. The ash spear traveled straight to its mark, and struck with a clang on the man's left shoulder, then bounced right off, as it might from a wall or a mountain cliff. Yet Achilles observed that the place where Cycnus had taken the impact was stained in blood, and he cried in delight. But his joy was unfounded. He hadn't inflicted a wound. The blood had come from Menoetes. Yelling with rage and frustration, he bounded down from his chariot, drawing his glittering sword to attack his imperturbable foe at close quarters. He found that his weapon was easily denting the helmet and shield, but was damaged itself when struck on the body. This was the limit. He lowered his shield to his side to come closer, and used his sword hilt to hammer his enemy full in the face and the forehead, again and again. As Cycnus retreated, Achilles followed, maintaining the pressure. He hassled and rushed him. He left his bewildered opponent no peace. The Trojan started to panic. Dark shadows were floating in front of his eyes. Then, while he was moving backwards across the plain, his steps were checked by a rock. Achilles thrust him down on his back right over the boulder, violently twisted him round, and dashed him onto the earth. Then, pressing his shield with his knees hard down on his victim's ribs, he pulled on the thongs of his helmet and tightened them under his chin, till the man was throttled and beaten at last. As Achilles got ready to strip the corpse, he saw that the armor was empty. Neptune had changed his son to the white-plumed bird called Cycnus, the swan. This strenuous fight led on to a truce which lasted for several days, when weapons were laid aside and the war was suspended. The Trojans patrolled their walls, while the Greeks kept watch on their earthworks. There came a festival day when the duel's victor, Achilles, was wooing Athena's favor by sacrificing a heifer. After the victim's entrails were laid on the altar flames, and the smell so welcome to heaven had wafted upwards, the gods received their share of the meat, and the rest was assigned to the banquet. The chiefs reclined on their couches and gorged themselves on the roasted flesh, with wine to relieve their cares no less than their thirst. They didn't rely for their entertainment on singing and music performed on the lyre or the multiple stops of the boxwood pipe. The night was spun out in serious talk, and the principal topic was manly courage. They described their battles, their own and the enemy's, taking turns to recite the dangers they'd faced and surmounted, many times over. What else would Achilles choose to expand on, and what would others prefer to discuss in his glorious presence? The conversation centered, of course, on Achilles' recent success in vanquishing Cycnus. Everyone found it amazing that someone should have a body that spears could never transfix, that made swords blunt and couldn't be overpowered by wounding. None of the Greeks, not Achilles himself, could solve the mystery. When Nestor commented, "Yes," he said, "in your generation Cycnus was surely unique in despising swords and possessing a body no spear could wound. But I long ago saw a person who suffered 1,000 cuts unscathed. His name was Caenis, Perhaebian Caenis, whose early home was Thessalian Othrys. His exploits won him renown, the more surprisingly so, as he started life as a woman." Nestor's novel pronouncement prompted a call from the company, voiced by Achilles, for details. "Out with the story, old Nestor. We're all of us eager to hear it, and you are the wisest man of our time, with a talent for speaking. Now tell us who Caenis was, and why did he change his sex? On what campaign did you get to know him? Whom was he fighting? And who in the world, if anyone, finally proved his undoing?" Nestor replied, "Old age has slowed my memory down, and there's much that I saw in my youngest days that I've now forgotten. But still I remember more, and there's nothing engraved on my mind more strongly than this particular story. I've done many things, both in war and in peace, and if anyone had the good fortune to witness plenty of gallant action because of prolonged old age, well, I've lived a couple of centuries, and now I'm into my third. Caenis, Elatus's daughter, was highly renowned for her beauty. Of all the maidens in Thessaly she was the fairest, and courted in vain by a wealth of suitors from all the neighboring cities. And yours, Achilles, as well. Her home was likewise in Phthia. Even your father Peleus might well have offered his hand if he hadn't already been married, or firmly engaged, perhaps, to Thetis, your mother. But Caenis accepted none of her suitors. One day she was strolling along a secluded beach on her own, when, according to Rumour's report, she was raped by the god of the sea. As Neptune savored the joy of his latest conquest, he said, "I'll allow you to ask for a gift which I promise not to refuse you. Now choose what you want to ask me." So the rumor continued. Caenis replied, "The wrong you have done me is great, so I'll ask you the greatest of favors I can. Let me never be able to suffer such wrong again. If you will make me a woman no more, your promise will be fulfilled." She delivered those final words in a lower voice, and they might have appeared to come from a man, as they surely did. The god of the sea had already granted Caenis's request, and had also bestowed an additional power. The new male body could never be wounded or fall at a sword's point. Caeneus departed, well pleased with the gift, and devoted his life to manly pursuits as he roamed the fields by the river Peneus. Pirithous, son of Ixion and king of the Lapiths, had married Hippodamia. He invited the cloud-born Centaurs to join the banquet at tables arranged in a leafy glen. The chieftains of Thessaly came. I, Nestor, also attended. The palace was filled with the festive hubbub of thronging guests. Now hark to the wedding hymn, torches and rising smoke in the great hall. Enter the bride, escorted by matrons and younger women, and looking a picture. We all declared how blessed Pirithous was in his beautiful wife, but our praises' effect as a lucky omen was almost undone, when the wildest of all the wild centaurs, Eurytus, drunk already, was further inflamed by the sight of the bride, and the power of wine, reinforced by desire, took over. Tables were upside down in a flash. The feast was reduced to a shambles, as Eurytus seized Pirithous' newlywed bride by the hair and forced her away, while each of the other centaurs grabbed any woman he fancied or found. The chaos resembled a captured city, and women were screaming all over the palace. We quickly rose from our couches. "Eurytus," shouted Theseus, taking the lead, "you must be crazy. How dare you provoke Pirithous while I live and foolishly injure us both?" The centaur said nothing. He couldn't defend his outrageous behavior by words, but used his unruly fists to punch the prince on the jaw and to pummel his chest. On a table nearby, there chanced to be lying an antique wine bowl, richly embossed with figures in high relief. The bowl was huge, but Theseus was huger. He lifted it up and hurled it directly in Eurytus' face. As globules of blood and fragments of brain poured out of the wound, the centaur, vomiting wine from his mouth, fell backwards and drummed with his heels on the sodden sand. His brothers, enraged by the carnage, vied with each other in shouting as one, "To arms! To arms!" Inspired by the wine with courage, they started the battle by sending their goblets flying, then breakable jars and round-lipped vessels, objects intended for feasts, now used for war and for slaughter. Amycus, son of Ophion, was first among the rampaging Centaurs to raid the inner rooms of the palace and plunder an iron stand which supported a cluster of burning candles. He lifted the whole thing high like a priest at a sacrifice straining to raise the axe which will cleave the neck of a pure white bull, then dashed it down on the forehead of Celadon, one of the Lapiths. This fractured his skull and mangled his face past all recognition. His eyes burst out of their sockets, the bones of his cheeks were shattered, the nose smashed inwards and jammed beneath the roof of his mouth. But another Lapith, called Peletes, wrenched the leg from a maple wood table and used it to hammer Amycus down to the ground, with his chin forced into his chest. As the centaur sputtered his teeth out, mingled with gore, a second blow dispatched him to Hades. Next to the four came Gryneus, who'd stood there, grimly inspecting the smoking altar, and said, "Why don't we make use of this?" With a frightening glare in his eyes, he lifted the hefty structure, fires and all, and hurled it into a group of the Lapiths. Two were crushed by the mountainous weight, Brodius and Oreos. Oreos' mother was Mycale, said to have often succeeded in drawing down the horns of the moon with her incantations. "You won't get away with this if I can get hold of a weapon," Exadius said, and then caught sight of some antlers nailed to a tall pine tree as a votive offering. There was his weapon. Armed with the horns of a stag, Exadius aimed for the centaur's eyeballs and gouged them out. One eye stuck fast on the antlers, and one rolled down onto Gryneus's beard, blood-coated, and clung there. There was Rhoetus, another centaur, snatching a blazing plumwood brand from the altar, and next attacking Charaxus to fracture his brow from the right. It was covered with golden curls, and the hair caught fire in an instant, like crops in a dry cornfield. The blood which flowed from the scorching wound made a terrible sizzling noise, like the sound of a red-hot bar of iron, when a blacksmith draws it with tongs from the furnace and plunges it into his trough. The metal sizzles and hisses when dipped in the cooling water. The wounded Lapith shook out the greedy fire from his curly hair, and tearing a slab from the threshold floor, he lifted it onto his shoulders. The mass was too heavy to reach the centaur. It weighed enough to be drawn by a cart. It landed instead on Cometes, a friend who was standing closer at hand, and it crushed him. Rhoetus couldn't contain his joy, and shouting, "May all the rest of your crew be as brave," he returned with his half-burnt torch to the wound he had started. With heavy, repeated blows, he battered Charaxus's skull, till bone and brains were reduced to a pulp. The victorious Rhoetus next attacked Euagris, Dryas, and Corythus, only a youth with the first fine hairs on his chin. When Corythus fell to the ground, Euagris cried to the centaur, "What glory is there in killing a boy?" The great brute wouldn't allow him to speak any further, and savagely thrust his flaming torch in Euagris's open mouth and forced it right down, into his gullet. He then went after the furious Dryas, whirling the brand round his head. This time he was less successful. There he was, gloating over all the Lapiths he'd slaughtered, when Dryas pierced him where the shoulder meets neck, with the point of a charred stake. Roaring, the centaur painfully wrenched the implement out from where it was lodged in the bone, and fled, now soaked in his own blood. Orneus and Lycabas followed him, Medon gashed in his strong right shoulder, Pisanor and Thaumas, Murmurus too, who had lately outstripped his brothers in running, but since he'd been wounded was only able to limp. Pholus and Melanius joined in the rout, with Abas the hunter of bears, and Asbalus, a prophet who'd vainly tried to dissuade the others from fighting. When Nessus was also fleeing in terror, Asbolus shouted out to him, saying, "You needn't run. You are being reserved for Hercules' bow." However, Eurynomus, Lycidas, Imbrius, along with Areus, failed to escape from death. They were all confronted by Dryas and fell to the ground. Cranaeus was also struck in the face, although he had turned in flight. As he glanced behind him, a javelin caught him between the eyes where the nose grows out of the forehead. In the midst of all this confusion, Aphitus, a centaur, was lying completely befuddled with wine, flat out, with his sleep unbroken, still holding his cup in his drooping hand and sprawled on the shaggy skin of a mountain bear. When Phorbas, a Lapith, observed him, across the hall, immobile and taking no part in the battle, he slipped his fingers inside the thong of his ash spear, crying, "Now you must mix your wine with Stygian water," then instantly hurled his javelin towards the youth, and the iron-tipped weapon transfixed his neck as he happened to lie with his head thrown back. Aphitus died feeling nothing. The dark blood welled from his throat and spilled all over the couch and even into his goblet. I, Nestor, noticed Patrias, another centaur, trying to lift an oak from the earth, while his arms were clasping it tightly, shaking it this way and that, and the roots were beginning to loosen. Pirithous cast his spear, which entered Patrias's ribcage, passed through his straining chest, and nailed him fast to the hard trunk. They say it was due to Pirithous' courage that Lycus and Chromis fell to the earth, but neither brought their conqueror greater glory than Dictys and Helops. The latter was killed by a javelin thrown from the right, which pierced his temples through to the left ear. Dictys was fleeing the son of Ixion's pursuit in a panic, and slipped from a mountain ridge, to tumble headlong and shatter a massive ash tree below, where his groin was impaled on the splinters. Apharius rushed to avenge him, and tearing a rock from the mountain, attempted to throw it. But Theseus forestalled him in the attempt by wielding an oak wood cudgel to break the bones of his massive forearm. This put Apharius out of action, and Theseus lacked in time or the inclination to finish him off. Instead, he leapt on the back of the towering centaur Bianor, who'd never accepted a rider before but himself. Then, digging his knees in the flanks of his mount, he gripped the curls of Bianor's hair with his left hand, forced the head back, lifted his knotted club, and battered the centaur's face on the bony temples and slaughter-threatening lips. Brave Theseus also succeeded in knocking over Nadimnus, the javelin-thrower Lycopes, and Hippasus, whose broad torso was veiled by his long beard, Ripheus, taller than all the trees, and Thoreus, trapper of bears, who transported them home from Thessaly's mountains alive and angry. Theseus's successes in fighting could not be further endured by the centaur Demoleon. Racing across to an age-old pine, he strained very hard to uproot it with trunk intact, but he failed. So he broke it off near the roots and flung it against his foe. As it hurled towards him, Theseus retreated well out of range, on Pallas Athena's prompting, or so he would have us believe. But the pine didn't fall before it had done some damage. It severed the breast and his strong left shoulder away from the neck of the tall Dolopian Crantor, your father's armor-bearer, Achilles. His king Amintor, defeated in war, had handed him over to Aeacus' son as a token and pledge of the peace between them. When Peleus saw from a distance that Crantor was foully dismembered, he cried out, "Dearest of henchmen, at least I can pay you a funeral tribute." His muscular arm then launched his javelin of ashwood straight at the centaur with all the strength of his body behind it. The weapon ruptured its target's ribcage and quivered, lodged in the bones. Demoleon managed to draw the shaft from his body, though that came slowly enough, but the tip was trapped in his lung. The pain inspired him with courage. Despite his faintness, he straightened his body and kicked right out at his foe with his horse's hooves. Peleus took the clattering blows on his shield and helmet. Then, guarding his shoulders by holding his weapons well forward, he pierced the brute's double torso, horse's and man's, with a single thrust. Peleus had earlier killed Phlegrius and Hyles at long range. Iphinuus perished in hand-to-hand combat, and likewise Caenis. Doralus made one more, who was wearing a wolfskin cap on his head, and whose hand wasn't armed with a pointed spear, but a splendid bracket of crooked-in bull's horns, richly reddened with blood. Here I was involved, as I plucked up courage to shout to the centaur, "Here now, see what your horns can do to counter my steel." And I threw my javelin. He couldn't avoid it and lifted his right hand up to his brow for protection. His hand was pinned to his forehead. A roar went up from the crowd, and, as Doralus helplessly stood there, stunned by the pain of his injury, Peleus, who was standing nearby, came forward and thrust his sword right under the belly. The centaur then bounded forward, trailing his guts on the ground. As he trailed them, he trampled them under his hooves. What he trampled he burst, till he caught his legs in the sludge and fell with his abdomen emptied. How about Solaris? He was a beauty, if centaurs can ever be called good-looking, but Silarus's looks couldn't save him in battle. His beard was just starting to grow, in a golden color, gold as the golden mane which streamed from his shoulders down to his withers. His face was handsome and strong, his neck and his shoulders, his hands, and his torso, all indeed of his human features, were like the work of a famous sculptor. His horse's parts lower down were no less perfect, unblemished, a mount for Castor if given a head and a neck, such a rideable back, such a muscular chest. He was blacker than pitch all over, except for his legs and his tail, which were white. Many female centaurs pursued him, but only Hylonome, fairest of all her kind to inhabit the forest, succeeded. Silarus hers alone. She held him by sweet endearments, by loving and saying she loved him, by making herself look attractive as far as a centaur can. She'd smooth her hair with a comb and entwine it with garlands of rosemary, violets or roses, and sometimes with pure white lilies. Twice every day she would wash her face in a spring which cascaded down from the heights of Pagasae's woods, and twice a day she would bathe in the river. She'd only drape her shoulder and side with animal fleeces which specially suited her. The lovers adored each other alike. They'd roam the mountains or rest in caves together. On this occasion they'd entered the hall of the Lapiths and joined in the fight at each other's side. Cast by a person unknown, a spear flew in from the left, and wounded Silarus just below the top of his chest. The heart had only been slightly injured, but after the weapon was pulled from his body, both heart and body went totally cold. Hylonome hurried to catch her expiring love as he fell. Resting her hand on the wound, she soothed it, and pressing her lips on his, she tried to prevent the escape of his fleeting breath. When she saw he was dead, she spoke a few words which the noise of battle prevented my hearing, before she fell on the spear that had wounded her partner, and died as she held him close in her arms for the last time. Another centaur I see in my mind had his horses and human parts protected alike by a blanket fashioned of lion skins, 6 of them, fastened together by knots. His name was Phaeacimes. Hurling a log which a pair of ox teams could barely have shifted, he cracked the head of Tectiphus, Olenus' son, on the crown. Then, while he was trying to strip the arms from his prostrate victim, I, Nestor, as Peleus your father, Achilles, will surely confirm, I plunged my blade in the spoiler's side. Old Chthonius, too, and Telebous fell to my sword. The former was wielding a forked branch, the other a spear, with which he actually gave me a wound. You can see the mark of it here in the scar still showing from that time, the time in my life when I ought to have come to the siege of Troy. That was the time when I might have checked, if I couldn't have beaten, the mighty Hector in battle. But Hector hadn't been born yet, or else he was only a boy, and now I'm too ancient to fight him. No need to mention how Periphas mastered the centaur Pirithous, or tell the story of Amphix, who managed to drive his unpointed cornel spear right into the face of four-footed Echeclus. Macarius killed Erigippus, who came from the Vale of Pelithron, by ramming a crowbar into his chest. I also remember a hunting spear flung by Nessus, which lodged in the groin of Simellus. You'd never suppose from what happened that Mopsus, Amphicus's son, was merely a prophet. When Mopsus speared the centaur Hodotes, his victim fell to the ground and vainly attempted to utter some words. But his tongue had been pinned to his chin, and his chin to his throat. How about Caenis? He killed 5 centaurs, Antimachus, Stipholus, Elymas, Bromus, and lastly Periclymenus, who fought with an axe. I can't remember their wounds, but only their names and the number. Then Latreus, a centaur of massive physique, rushed forward to face him, armed with the spoils of Halisus, a Macedonian he'd slaughtered. In age he was past his youth, and his temples were flecked with gray, but his strength was still a young man's. His helmet, shield, and exotic pike attracted all eyes as he proudly turned to each army, brandished his weapons, and pranced around in a well-traced circle, flinging a torrent of insolent taunts in the empty air. Caenis, you bitch! Must I tolerate you? You will always be female and kindness to me. Perhaps you forget your original sex. Do you ever recall what you did to deserve your reward? Do you think of the price which you paid to achieve this specious masculine body? Look at the girl you were born, and the shame that she suffered. Then go, return to your distaff and basket of wool. Go back to your spinning and leave the fighting to men. As Latreus was galloping past him, shouting these insults, Caenis let fly with his spear, which made a great gash in the mocker's side, where man and horse are united. Maddened by pain, the centaur cast at the hero's uncovered head with his pike. The weapon rebounded like hail off a rooftop, or pebbles dropped on a drum. Then Latreus attacked at close quarters and struggled to bury his sword in the young man's side, but the side was too hard. There was no way in. You won't escape me, he shouted. You'll die on the edge of my sword, since the point's been blunted. So turning his weapon sideways, he reached to slash him around his thighs. But the blow produced no more than a thud. The flesh might well have been marble. The metal was broken to splinters on striking such tough skin. Caenis was tired of exposing his still unwounded limbs to the stupefied centaur. Come on, he said to him. Now let's see how your body responds to my steel. And he plunged his death-dealing sword right up to the hilt in his enemy's trunk, and compounded the damage by turning and twisting the sunken blade right into his vitals. On came the centaurs, shouting and yelling, rushing in frenzy, everyone hurling or thrusting their weapons against one foe. Those weapons were blunted and fell to the ground, while Caenis remained unscathed by all of their blows. Not a drop of his blood had been spilt. This turn of events left the centaurs dumbfounded. Shameful, disgraceful, Monachus cried. Our whole tribe worsted by one man, hardly a man at that. No, he is a man, and we are behaving as feebly as women. What use is this massive girth of our bodies? What of our double strength? Has nature combined in ourselves the courage and force of the world's two mightiest creatures for nothing? Our mother a goddess? I don't believe it. Our father cannot have been Ixion, a mortal with pride enough to aspire to sleep with Juno on high, when we are defeated by someone whose sex is in doubt. Let us roll the boulders, the trees, whole mountains on top of this upstart. Let's hurl the forests and crush the life from his living body. His throat will be choked by the bulk of it all, and the weight will prove as good as a wound. So saying, he seized a trunk knocked down, as it chanced, by the south wind's fury, and threw it against his unwoundable foe. The rest did the same. In a short while, Othrys was stripped of its trees and Pelion empty of shade. Crushed beneath that enormous layer, the hero sweltered under the weight of the trees, and heaved with his sturdy shoulders to raise the pile. But after the load grew greater and greater over his head, and he couldn't breathe through his mouth any longer, consciousness left him. But then he recovered and vainly attempted to roll the trees off his body and lift himself up to obtain some air. For a while he succeeded in moving the surface, as if Mount Ida, which look, we can see over there, was disturbed by an earthquake. No one is certain what happened next. Some said that his body was thrust right down by the mass of the trees to the shadows of Hades. Mopsus the seer said no. He'd noticed a rust-winged bird emerging out of the pile and soaring into the air. I also sighted the bird that day for the first and the last time. Mopsus watched it gently circling the camp, and he heard it loudly clapping its wings. As he thoughtfully followed it round with his eyes, he exclaimed, "All hail! Hail Caenis, pride of the Lapiths, once unique among men, and now sole bird of your kind." The prophet said it, and we believed it. Grief made our anger all the more bitter. That one man's life should be crushed by so many. To vent our sorrow, we turned on the Centaurs and didn't cease fighting, till most had been killed, and the rest were en route or were rescued by night. As Nestor described the battle between the Lapiths and Centaurs, Tlepolemus, Hercules' son, was deeply distressed that his father had not been mentioned, and couldn't contain his resentment in silence. "Sir Nestor," he cried, "I'm amazed that you have forgotten Hercules' glorious exploits. I'm sure that my father frequently told me the Centaurs were conquered by him." Old Nestor ruefully answered him, "Why must you force me now to remember wrongs and reopen sorrows that time has healed? Do I need to explain the reasons which led me to hate your father? His deeds, heaven knows, surpassed belief, and the world must acknowledge the good that he did, though I'd rather be able myself to deny it. My praises haven't included Deiphobus or Polydamas, even Hector, for nobody praises his foes. Your illustrious father had razed the walls of Messene, and next he destroyed the innocent cities of Elis and Pylos, where my palace was ravaged by fire and sword. Of the many he slaughtered, I'll only refer to the sons of Neleus, 12 of us then, and we made a splendid group of young warriors. Hercules killed all 12, with the sole exception of me. I had to accept the death of my older brothers, but one strange death stands out, Periclymenus's. Neptune, the founder of Neleus's line, had invested this youth with the power of adopting whatever shape he desired, and of changing back to his normal form. At Hercules' coming, he'd run the gamut of metamorphosis without the slightest effect, till he changed to the form of the bird, so dear to the king of the gods, which transports his bolts in its talons. Using his eagle's strength, Periclymenus tore at Hercules' face with his flapping wings, hooked beak, and his sharp, curved claws. The hero from Tiryns then bent his all too unerring bow against the creature, and while it was hovering high in the clouds, an arrow entered its breast quite close to one of its wings. The wound was not very deep, but the sinews torn on that side could serve it no longer. All movement and flying power were lost. The eagle fell to the earth, as its weakened wings could no longer catch the air to support them, and where the arrow had lightly lodged in the wing, it was forced by the weight of the crashing body through to the top of the breast and out by the neck on the left side. Now, Tlepolemus, handsome chief of the Rhodian fleet, do you really believe that I owe your father a public eulogy? Nevertheless, my silence about his exploits completes the vengeance I owe my brothers. My friendship with you is unbroken. So Neleian Nestor charmingly answered Hercules' son. When the old man's story was finished, the wine went round once again, and everyone rose from their couches to sleep for the rest of the night. But the god who rules the waves with his trident grieved as a father for Cycnus, the son whose body he'd changed to a swan like Phaeton's friend. He detested the cruel Achilles so much that he crossed the bounds of civilized conduct to vent his implacable anger. The war against Troy had now dragged on for about 10 years, when Neptune strongly appealed to his long-haired Sminthean nephew. Apollo, the one of my brother Jupiter's sons whom I love the best, who joined me in building the walls of Troy unrewarded, do you heave a sigh when you look at these towers so soon to fall? Do you rue the slaughter of so many thousands defending the city? Not to mention each one, are you haunted at least by the ghost of Hector, whose body was dragged all round the stronghold he fought for? Meanwhile, that monster Achilles, a man more blood-polluted than war itself, lives on to ravage the work of our hands. Let him come my way. I'll ensure that he feels the power of my trident. But since I may not engage with my foe directly, I ask you to shoot an invisible arrow to catch the brute unawares. Apollo agreed, his wishes exactly accorded with Neptune's. Hiding his presence in cloud, he came to the Trojan lines. And there, in the midst of the general carnage, he noticed Paris shooting away in desultory fashion at common Greek soldiers. The god revealed who he was and said to him, "Why are you wasting your shafts on the rank and file? If you care at all for your family, target Achilles and take revenge for your slaughtered brethren." So saying, he pointed the hero out, still hacking the Trojans down. Then turning Paris's bow in the same direction, he guided an arrow with deadly aim at Achilles' heel. If Priam, after the death of Hector, had cause for rejoicing, this surely was it. So Achilles, who'd vanquished the mightiest heroes, was vanquished himself by a coward who'd stolen the wife of his Greek host. If he was destined to die at the hands of a woman in war, he'd rather have been cut down by the axe of Penthesilea. Now the terror of all the Trojans, the pride and bulwark of Greece's name, Achilles the hero unequaled in battle, had ended in flames. The Vulcan, the god who had forged his armor, had fired his body to ashes. All that remained of Achilles the Great was a small amount of material, barely sufficient to fill an urn. But his fame lives on to fill the expanse of the whole wide world. His glory measures up to the man, it matches his noble self, untouched by shadowy Hades. Even the shield of Achilles proclaimed the hero who'd owned it. It prompted a conflict, and arms were taken up for his arms. None of the others ventured to claim them, not Diomedes, Ajax, the son of Oileus, not Menelaus, not even his elder and far more valiant brother, King Agamemnon. Only Ulysses and Ajax the son of Telamon reckoned their prowess was such as to merit a prize so very prestigious. To avoid the invidious task of deciding between them himself, Agamemnon summoned the Argive chiefs to a court in the heart of the camp and referred the dispute to the judgment of all in the session.